Imagine booting up your computer and instantly feeling like the system understands you, not just in terms of performance, but in the way it looks, behaves, and quietly stays out of your way while you get real work done. That is the promised Linux Mint 23, codenamed Nova, is built around, and this release is not just another incremental update in the long life of Mint. It represents a philosophical shift in how a desktop Linux distribution can evolve without betraying its core audience. Linux Mint has always been about balance, about giving users a rock-solid base that feels familiar while slowly modernizing under the hood. With Nova, that balance finally tips into something bigger. This is the release where Mint stops merely reacting to changes in the Linux ecosystem and instead starts setting its own long-term direction in a much stronger way. To understand why Linux Mint 23 Nova matters so much, you have to understand where Mint comes from. Mint built its reputation by being the distribution people recommend when someone asks. I want to try Linux, but I don't want pain. It focused on usability, same defaults, and a desktop experience that did not feel experimental. Over the years, that approach earned Mint a massive and loyal user base, but it also came with criticism. Some people said Mint was too conservative, too slow to adopt new technologies, too focused on the past. Nova is the answer to that criticism, but not in the way many expected. Instead of chasing trends blindly, Linux Mint 23 rethinks how modern Linux should feel for everyday users and power users alike, while keeping the stability that made Mint famous. One of the biggest changes in Linux Mint 23 Nova is how polished and cohesive the entire desktop experience feels. Cinnamon, which has always been Mint's flagship desktop environment, reaches a level of maturity here that honestly feels like a turning point. Animations are smoother, not in a flashy or distracting way, but in a way that makes the system feel alive and responsive. Window transitions feel intentional. Workspace switching feels fluid, and subtle visual feedback gives you confidence that the system is responding instantly to your input. This is not about eye candy for the sake of it. It is about reducing friction between you and your computer, something many desktop environments talk about but rarely achieve as cleanly as this. Under the hood, Cinnamon in Nova benefits from deeper optimizations that most users will never see but will definitely feel. Memory usage is better managed, especially in long sessions where many applications stay open for hours or even days. The desktop no longer slowly degrades over time, which used to be a quiet frustration for some users. CPU usage during idle is lower, which matters not just for laptops but also for desktops that stay on all day. These improvements make Mint 23 feel lighter, even though it is doing more than ever before. Another area where Linux Mint 23 Nova shines is hardware support. This release clearly acknowledges that the Linux user base is no longer just people with 10-year-old ThinkPads. Modern laptops, high-resolution displays, hybrid graphics, fast NVMe storage, and the latest CPUs are now common, and Mint finally treats them as first-class citizens. Out of the box, hardware detection is faster and more accurate. Wi-Fi chips that previously required manual tweaking now work immediately in most cases. BLUETOOTH, reliability is noticeably better, especially with headphones and game controllers. High DPI scaling, which used to be a weak point for Cinnamon, is now consistent and predictable, even when mixing displays with different resolutions. Power management also sees meaningful improvement in Nova. On laptops, battery life is better not because of one magic feature, but because of dozens of small optimizations working together. Background services are smarter about when they wake up. The system is better at identifying when you are on battery versus plugged in and adjusts behavior accordingly. Suspend and resume are more reliable, which might sound boring, but anyone who has lost work due to a broken sleep cycle knows how important this is. Linux Mint 23 feels like a distribution you can trust to behave properly when you close the lid and walk away. Software management, one of Mint's traditional strengths, takes another step forward in Nova. The software manager is faster, cleaner, and more informative without overwhelming the user. Applications load quicker, search results appear instantly, and descriptions are clearer about what an app does and where it comes from. There is a stronger emphasis on verified and trusted sources, which helps new users feel safer installing software without needing to understand the complexities of Linux packaging. Flatpak integration is tighter and more seamless, giving users access to newer versions of applications without compromising system stability. At the same time, traditional packages remain the default where they make sense, preserving Mint's philosophy of stability first. What really stands out in Linux Mint 23 Nova is how it handles updates. Updates have always been a sensitive topic in Linux, with some distributions pushing bleeding-edge software and others moving at a glacial pace. Nova strikes a middle ground that feels surprisingly mature. Security updates are fast and automatic when needed, but major changes are communicated clearly. The Update Manager does a better job of explaining what an update does, why it matters, and what the potential impact could be. This transparency builds trust, especially for users who rely on their systems for work and cannot afford surprises. Privacy and control are another area where Linux Mint 23 Nova quietly but firmly draws a line. In an era where many operating systems increasingly phone home, track usage, and push online accounts, Mint continues to say no. Nova reinforces that stance with clearer privacy defaults and better visibility into what the system is doing. There is no forced telemetry, no account requirement, no hidden background data collection. For users who care about digital independence, this is not just a feature, it is a statement. Linux Mint 23 feels like it respects you as the owner of your computer, not as a product. Customization has always been a selling point for Linux, and Mint 23 Nova expands on that without turning the system into a mess of options. Themes are more consistent across applications, reducing the visual mismatch that sometimes plagued Linux desktops. Icons, window borders, and system colors feel unified, making the desktop look professionally designed rather than stitched together. At the same time, advanced users still have access to deep customization tools, from panel layouts to keyboard shortcuts to applets and extensions. Nova manages to be friendly to newcomers while still being a playground for tinkerers. Performance improvements in Linux Mint 23 Nova deserve special attention because they affect every single user. Boot times are shorter, application launch times are faster, and overall responsiveness feels snappier. These gains come not from aggressive optimizations that risk stability, but from careful refinement. Services that are no longer needed by default have been trimmed. Startup processes are better ordered. Disk access is more efficient. The result is a system that feels modern and quick, even on modest hardware, while absolutely flying on newer machines. Gaming on Linux Mint has historically been a mixed experience, largely dependent on external tools and user patience. With Nova, gaming becomes a more straightforward proposition. Graphics driver handling is smoother, making it easier to get optimal performance without manual intervention. Steam, Proton, and related technologies integrate cleanly, allowing many Windows games to run with minimal setup. While Mint is not suddenly a gaming-focused distribution, Nova removes many of the small annoyances that used to push gamers toward other distros. It feels like Mint finally acknowledges gaming as a legitimate and important use case. Security improvements in Linux Mint 23 Nova go beyond just updates. System hardening is stronger by default, reducing the attack surface without impacting usability. Application sandboxing, especially through Flatpak, is more clearly presented to the user, making it easier to understand what an app can and cannot access. Firewall configuration remains simple but effective, and there is less need for users to dive into terminal commands to feel safe. For everyday users, this means peace of mind. For advanced users, it means a solid foundation they can build on. One of the most interesting aspects of Linux Mint 23 Nova is how it positions itself in the broader Linux ecosystem. Mint has always been based on Ubuntu, and that remains true here, but the relationship feels more deliberate. Nova takes advantage of Ubuntu's stability and hardware support, while clearly differentiating itself in terms of user experience and philosophy. It avoids controversial changes that have upset some users elsewhere, choosing instead to refine what works. This makes Mint 23 feel less like a derivative and more like its own complete operating system. Accessibility also sees improvements in Nova, an area that often gets overlooked. Better font rendering, improved contrast options, and more reliable input handling make the system easier to use for people with different needs. These changes are subtle, but they matter. They reflect a growing awareness that a truly great operating system should be usable by as many people as possible. not just those with perfect vision and dexterity. For content creators, developers, and professionals, Linux Mint 23 Nova feels especially compelling. Development tools are easy to install and up to date without sacrificing system stability. Media creation applications run smoothly, and hardware acceleration works more reliably. The desktop stays responsive even under heavy load, which is crucial for tasks like video editing, compiling code, or running virtual machines. Mint has always been good for work, but Nova makes it feel truly professional. Perhaps the most important reason Linux Mint 23 Nova feels like it changes Linux forever is not any single feature, but the confidence behind it. This release feels intentional. It feels like the Mint team knows exactly who their audience is and what they want, and they are no longer afraid to evolve on their own terms. Nova does not chase hype. It does not try to reinvent the desktop just to be different. Instead, it perfects the fundamentals in a way that makes the entire experience feel complete. For new users, Linux Mint 23 Nova is an incredibly inviting entry point into Linux. Installation is straightforward, the system works out of the box, and the learning curve is gentle. For longtime Linux users, Nova offers a sense of calm, reliability combined with modern performance and polish. It proves that you do not need to sacrifice stability to feel current, and you do not need to sacrifice usability to have power. In the bigger picture, Linux Mint 23 Nova sends a message to the Linux world. It shows that desktop Linux does not need to constantly reinvent itself to stay relevant. It can focus on refinement, user respect, and long-term stability, and still feel exciting. Nova is the kind of release that makes people stop distro hopping and finally settle down. It is the kind of system you install and then forget about, not because it is boring, but because it simply works. As you use Linux Mint 23 Nova day after day, what stands out is how little it gets in your way. There are fewer moments of frustration, fewer things to fix, fewer compromises to accept. Everything feels thoughtfully designed, from the way notifications behave to how settings are organized. This is what maturity looks like in an operating system. Not flashy headlines, but quiet excellence. Linux Mint 23 Nova may not literally change Linux overnight, but it absolutely changes expectations. It raises the bar for what a mainstream Linux desktop can and should be. It proves that user-focused design, technical competence, and respect for freedom can coexist without conflict. And for a project that started as a simple idea to make Linux easier, that is a powerful evolution. For the Linux Chronicle audience, this is the kind of release that deserves attention. Linux Mint 23 Nova is not just another version number, it is a statement of intent, a refined vision of what desktop Linux can be in the modern era. If this is the direction Mint continues to follow, the future of Linux on the desktop looks not just promising, but genuinely exciting.